So good day, everybody. My name is Samuel Olutunde Drosharo. I'm a lecturer at the Department of Animal Breeding and Genetics, Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta, Ogun State in Nigeria. My area of interest is behavioral genetics. I work on welfare and behavior of turkeys and chickens. And I work on fear, aggression, play behavior, oil-related behavior, comfort, and sleeping behavior in these two birds. And of recent, I developed interest in chicken and turkey vocalizations. So I welcome everybody to Animal Welfare Group Nigeria with the acronym AWGN. AWGN was founded in 2019 after a gathering of students and lecturers from the Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta, Ogun State in Nigeria. And this group has three missions. The first mission is to increase awareness about animal behavior and welfare in Nigeria, Africa, and the world at large. The second mission is to foster collaboration and networking among researchers who are into the field of animal behavior and welfare. And the third one is to educate the public on the importance of animal welfare. So if you want to listen to interesting topics on animal welfare, just join our group, register for the presentation, get the Zoom link, and you are going to enjoy yourself. And we have been doing this for more than 2 years now. And we have more than 40 presentations from renowned scientists. So we meet every first and third Wednesdays to discuss issues that are related to animal welfare and behavior. That is for our webinars. And we also have inaugural lectures that are presented by renowned scientists in the field of animal welfare and behavior. People from different parts of the world have presented on issues that are related to ethical practices, slaughtering, fear, stress, cognition, neuroscience, archery practices, One Earth, big data, open science, in livestock, fishes, pets, animal, and wildlife. And today's presentation is the 7th virtual inaugural lecture. We have had 6. We have people like Temple Grandin presenting, Donald Bloom, and a lot of them. So today's presenter is Mark Rutter from Harper University in the United Kingdom. Mark will be talking on the motivation of dairy cows for pasture access and comfortable lying spaces. So, like I said, my name is Joshua Samuel. I'll be the host and the moderator. So before Mark will start his presentation, I'm going to read his bio. Now I'm going to give some rules. So to his bio, Mark Rutter is a professor of applied animal behavior at Harper University in United Kingdom. After graduating in agricultural sciences at the University of Leeds, he gained an MSc into biological computation from the University of York before being awarded a PhD in animal behavior from the University of Edinburgh. Mark has studied the behavior and welfare of a wide range of animals, including beef and dairy cattle, sheep, goat, white deer, laying hens, and broilers. His current research is focused on how an understanding of the natural behavior of domestic cattle can be used to improve their production efficiency as well as their welfare. And this includes understanding the factors that affect dairy cow preference and motivation for pasture and comfortable lying spaces. Mark has been applying his expertise in the emerging field of precision livestock farming, helping technology companies to develop commercial and sensor-based systems to improve estrus detection and monitor health in dairy cow. It is worthy to also say that Mark Rutter is the president of ISAH. So these are the rules. Please, when you join us, please mute yourself. And if you have any question, you drop it in the chat box for Mark. He's going to do justice to all the questions at the end of the presentation. So Mark, you can start your presentation.
Right, thank you very much, Samuel. Let me try and pull up the presentation and share it. So hopefully, can you confirm you've got a full screen there? I'll just move.
Yes, we do.
Excellent. Right. So no, thank you for that introduction. And I'm keeping an eye on the clock because this is quite a long, I've been given quite a long time period, and I need to make sure I don't get too distracted and spend too much time on some things. But we're going to have about somewhere between about sort of 50 minutes to an hour, really looking at an area that I've been spending probably about the last 10, 12 years working on, which is, again, understanding really what it is that cows want, either from going out to pasture, going outside, or what can we do to make sure they have nice, comfortable places to lie down. And again, I would like to thank the organisers for inviting me along. You've had some really good speakers. You've done a fantastic job in getting some of the world's greatest people. I wouldn't necessarily put myself in that category, but I'm very honoured to be part of such a sort of prestigious sort of programme of presentations. So in terms of what I'm going to be covering, a little bit about me so you can understand sort of where I'm coming from. I'll talk a little bit about the history of cattle housing. So I do apologise. I haven't been to Nigeria. I have been to Kenya, but only on holiday. I'm not that familiar with cattle production systems in sort of sub-Saharan Africa, and it would be interesting for me to learn more about them. But I'm hoping you will sort of, we'll talk a little bit about welfare assessment in general, and also hopefully what I'm talking about, you'll have, some ideas of how it can be applied, not only to, European, North American cattle, but gives us some insight into what it is that perhaps animals want. I'll talk a bit about preference versus motivation, and just a bit about the difference between them and why we've looked at them. And then the main part of the talk will be running through 8 studies. We've actually done about 12, but I've got it down to 8 studies that will hopefully give you some insight into, again, what it is that influences cow preference for pasture and open lying spaces. And then very briefly at the end, talk a little bit about what cow housing might look like in the future before having a bit of a summary. So in terms of a bit about me, you've heard a bit about my sort of academic background. What really informed me in my early years was I had an uncle who had a sheep and beef farm. This was up in the Yorkshire Dales. This was an upland farm. And I used to visit there for all of my school holidays, working on this farm. And here you can see me, again, this would have been in the 1980s. That's me over right on the right there. We're putting hay into what's called a cow house, a cowhouse. And it sort of struck me when I was putting the presentation together that actually I seem to have had this interest in cow housing, even 40 odd years ago, I was sort of still interested in that. But then, as you've heard, I studied agriculture at Leeds, went on to study biological computation, maths, stats, and computing. This is really through an interest in digital computing, and it allowed me to bring together ideas around, behavior and automatic recording of animal behavior. And then I did my PhD, and I was very fortunate to be supervised by Ian Duncan, who no doubt many of you will have come across his publications. So I'm now a professor of applied animal behaviour at Harper Adams, and as has already been mentioned, I'm president of the International Society for Applied Ethology. So when we think about cattle, I always do like to think and have these discussions with our students. Let's think about really how they've evolved. What have cows evolved to do? And then how has perhaps their behaviour changed since we have domesticated them? And really, for most of their domestication history, cattle have spent either all of their lives outside, or at least part of their lives would have been spent out at grass. And these are some feral cattle that is from a population in England. It gives us an idea of what the ancestors of the cows, of domestic cows, might have looked like. But we started to bring them inside. It would have been associated with protection from predators, also bringing them in the winter when the ground conditions, when it's too wet. And actually for quite a lot of, maybe the last 400 or 500 years, it's been quite traditional, certainly across Europe, to actually live in a building with the cattle. So this is fairly typical of a Devon longhouse. I'd lived down in Devon for quite a few years. The humans would live at one end, the cattle at the other. So, you know, we pretty much shared the same housing as the cattle. Obviously, the cattle would have been tethered. I showed you those photographs earlier on of me loading, putting those bales of hay. So this is dried grass being put away for winter forage. This actually shows you the fairly typical scene in the Yorkshire Dales. We have a village there. In the fields, you can see lots of these buildings. Well, each one of those buildings is what we call a cow house or a cowus in the Yorkshire dialect. And the winter feed was taken to those houses. We can just isolate one of them. The grass would be cut from the field in the summer, would go in for the winter feed. And the cattle would spend the summer outside on the pastures above the village, but in the winter they would be housed. And this is what the inside of the cowus looked like. We can see there we've got 6 cattle. They would be tethered, and I can well remember, this was when I was working on the farm 40 years ago. This was exactly what we had. We were feeding them hay, and the cows were tethered there within the barn. So again, we've been housing animals for quite a long time, traditionally housing them in the winter. Now we are moving away, or actually before I move on to that, just to say, this just shows you another picture from the 1980s. This again is in Yorkshire, not actually one of my photographs, but just illustrating milking cows by hand with them being tied up inside. You know, it's something that we've been doing for hundreds of years. Now we're gradually getting rid of these tie stalls. They are being phased out across, you know, much of Europe, parts of North America. It's still quite common in Canada and Norway, where the animals are in one of these stalls or a cubicle. They're tied up. But certainly across, you know, pretty much across Europe, North America now, we've got rid of the ties and we've moved to these free stalls. So what's illustrated in this photograph here is actually, you know, the commonest way of keeping cattle in much of Europe, certainly in the United Kingdom, across most of the United States, where we have what we call these free stalls. The cattle are free to come and go to those stalls. And then obviously they either go to a robotic milker, which they have in this picture here, or they would go, they'd be taken and would be milked separately. So we've been housing animals this way, you know, for quite a long time. And we use cubicles. We have these lying spaces for cows. They're very much preferred because they give good cow hygiene. So the idea is that the cows will defecate into a passageway where the feces can be taken away and they're lying on a clean area. So it's all about keeping the udder clean. But at other times when the cows are not actually lactating, when they're in this dry, what we call the dry stage, between lactations, they're often actually housed in what we call a straw yard, this open straw yard, also called loose housing. So cattle, when they're housed, they're spending most of the time in cubicles. Part of the year they will be on this loose housing. And then in the summer, it's been traditional for the animals to go out to pasture. But actually what we're starting to see, certainly within, again, Europe, the United Kingdom, North America, is a lot of dairy farmers are now moving to what we call continuous housing. So the cows are being kept indoor all year round. They never get to go out. And one of the reasons when you talk to farmers about, well, why are you doing this? It's the weather, and climate change is having a big impact. Often we're getting much wetter periods of time. We're getting heat waves, which Europe is experiencing at the moment. So there's a lot of variability in the availability of grass at pasture. If the ground's very wet, then the animals can damage the soil. So this is one of the reasons why a lot of dairy farmers are moving to keeping their cows indoors all year round. But people are raising objections to that. They're making arguments on the grounds of animal welfare, that it's wrong that the animals should be kept in all year round. So Compassion in World Farming have had several campaigns. One of them, Cows Belong on Pasture. And then here's just an image from their website. Again, just illustrating the problems of continuous housing, which seems to be a feature of the part of Italy where Parmesan cheese is created. trying to argue that, you know, cows should be allowed outside. And certainly compared to pasture or these straw yards, you know, cows in these cubicle houses have generally got higher levels of lameness. Mastitis can be a problem, possibly related to, obviously it would be associated with milk production, but there can be health issues with cattle when they are kept in these sort of continuous housing systems. But it is worth just saying that there are times when actually pasture can itself cause problems. Fairly rare, fortunately, but can have a very big impact. So this was what, 10 years, nearly 10 years ago now. There were some severe unseasonal blizzards, again, probably climate change, in North America, in the United States, South Dakota, killed tens of thousands of cattle. And again, they weren't expecting these conditions, and the cattle themselves weren't habituated to the sort of the cold and the snow. So, and the farmers weren't able to provide the supplemental feed. So it was you know, we can see problems with having, you know, animals out at pasture under some conditions. But I think we decided, well, what do the cows want? Humans are very good at trying to decide what's right and wrong for animal welfare. Well, what is it that the cows want? If we can understand what the cows want, what they need, then we can start to think about designing systems that hopefully are good for their health, that allow them to be productive, but also meet their own needs, so therefore going to be good for their welfare. So this really was the key question, and this is going to be the key question I'm going to be addressing in the presentation, is what do cows want? Do they want to have housing with 3 stalls, with the cubicles, as we can see there, or do they want to be out at pasture, out in the open, as we can see on the right? So we're going to be talking about preference. So this is, again, you let an animal choose what it wants. And I think it's a very important first step in trying to understand their needs. And certainly when you are looking at preference, it's good to try and understand, well, what factors influence their preference, because this then also gives us some insight into what it is, what's important to the animals, and what factors are sort of influencing what they're doing. So preference is important, but preference doesn't tell us everything. And what it doesn't tell us is, well, how important is it to the animal that it can actually make that choice? And really the next step beyond just simple preference testing is to look at motivation. And what we're doing when we're trying to assess motivation is saying, well, yeah, how important is a particular thing to the animals? But then also we can assess how important it is by trying to see, will the animals pay a price in terms of getting their preferred choice? But we need to be careful when we start asking what sort of price they should pay, because we need to make sure it's something that is a meaningful choice. And I think I'm going to illustrate that by, so I'm a meat eater. There might be some vegetarians, no doubt will be vegetarians, vegans on the call. I'm a meat eater, so my analogy is from eating meat. So let's imagine I'm going to be at this congress in Tallinn, International Society for Applied Pathology Congress in Tallinn, in just over a week. And I think it's perhaps for lunch we can have a choice between, or I could be given a choice as a meat eater between having a burger or having a nice steak. So I think, okay, the burger looks tasty, but I do like steak. So on the first day, I choose the steak. Go down for lunch on the second day. Well, unfortunately, a lot of people chose the steak yesterday. So we've had to charge a small surcharge. So there's now a $5 charge. If I have the steak, I can have the burger for free, but I have to pay $5 to have the steak. Well, that steak was jolly good yesterday. I'm going to go for the steak again, so I will pay $5. Third day, I go down. Oh, well, sorry, sir, we've had to put the price up again. So you now have got to pay $10 to get your steak, or you can have the burger for free. Well, okay, $10, quite a bit of money, but it was a good steak. I'll pay the $10. You can probably see where this is going. The third day, oh, sorry, sir, it's now $15. Right, I'm not paying $15 for the steak. I'll have the burger. So I've you've been able to assess my motivation, or if you look at that, I'm willing to pay $10, not $15 for the particular stake. So it gives you some indication of the importance to me. But of course, it does depend how important or what the value of $15 is. And I think this is really where it's about getting that price meaningful, because $15 for the half of the world's population that has to live on less than $7 a day, even paying $5 is going to be too much money. Whereas if you're one of these three men, then $15 is absolutely nothing to you whatsoever. So we have to get the price, we do need to make sure that the price paid is meaningful. So what do we mean by meaningful? Well, if we make, for the particular individuals being tested for their preference, if the price is too expensive, in other words, if they can't afford to pay even the minimum price, then clearly it's not a meaningful, the price we're asking is not meaningful. Similarly, if the price is too cheap, and actually the individuals can very easily afford to pay the maximum, then again, that's not meaningful. What we really want is what we saw with my meat and burger choice, my steak and burger choice, is we want hopefully somewhere within the range of prices that we're asking, somewhere within that we sort of hit a limit. And that sort of shows that we're in the price range that is about right, is meaningful. So that's something that we look for when we actually carry out these studies. Are we in this meaningful window in terms of price? Right, anyway, let's get on to the experiments. We've got 8 of them to get through. So let's have a look at what is it that seems to drive the preference and motivation of dairy cows in terms of access to open pasture. So we have these 8 studies. We're going to run through them in turn. And the first one was actually one of my PhD students, Gemma Charlton's first experiment. This was the very first study we did looking at this. And it was really, we wanted something that would help us form some hypotheses to test later on. But we simply gave the cows a choice. So the cows that we were using were being milked twice a day. After they'd been milked, they would go to a choice point. This was halfway between indoor housing, which was a cubicle, as you can see there, or pasture. This was them out on pasture. And they would go to the choice point, and we actually arranged it. So half of the time they approached from the left, half of the time from the right. So it wasn't always a case of I have to turn, if I turn one way, I always go inside. Half the time turning left it took you in. The other half turning left would take you out. So we arranged all of that. So we recorded what they did when they were given a choice at this choice point, this one-off initial choice. And then we gave them free access between the pasture and indoors. So they were free to come and go, and we recorded how much time they spent in each. So when they went out to pasture, there was some grass available for them to eat. The dry matter content was okay. It wasn't, when it was 3,000 kilograms of dry matter, that's pretty good. 1,800, there would be some grass for them to eat. But when they went inside, they had access to their total mixed ration. And I think it's just worth saying a little bit about these total mixed rations, TMRs, because they feature a lot in the rest of the presentation. So this is a feed that's formulated for the cows, what's called a ration. It contains a fiber component. The majority component is fiber. So that's either grass or maize silage that's been chopped up. But then a nutritionist designs a mix of other nutrients and things to put in. So there'll be maybe some soy proteins, some minerals will be added to this, and it's formulated such that it should meet the needs of the cow. So this is what we mean by a total mixed ration, and it's available ad libitum, and it's quite easy for the cows to eat. When they're grazing, they have to bite and chew the grass, whereas they can just effectively take mouthfuls, chew them a little bit of the total mixed ration and consume it. So this was the experimental setup. So what did we find? Well, surprisingly, we thought these cows would go outside. They didn't very much. At the choice point, 2/3 of the time, they just went straight inside, and only 1/3 of the time at the choice point did they actually go out. What we did find, though, and this is going to be a theme coming through the rest of the studies, we didn't know when we did it at the beginning, but this is, again, this does come up as a very strong theme, was there seems to be a stronger preference for pasture in the afternoon or at night. So following morning milking, about 80% of the time they chose to go inside, whereas we were getting a bit closer to 50-50 when it came to afternoon milking. So they were more inclined to go out to pasture following afternoon milking rather than morning milking. But when we actually look at how much time they spent in the different locations, they actually spent over 90% of their time inside, and they only spent about 8% outside. So this did surprise us. We thought these cows would be spending more time outside. You know, the story, we've heard the stories, compassion in world farming, cows belong outside. So it did surprise us. What we did find, though, there were some factors that influenced preference. So when it's raining, the cows were more likely to be inside. They don't like being outside when it's wet. The high-yielding cows also spent more time inside. Again, you can probably understand this from the point of view of them needing to eat that total mixed ration. So they're clearly drawn in for that. And then any cows, there's a tendency for cows with a low body condition score to spend time inside. So it did surprise us that the cows were spending most of their time inside. And we really came up with 3 hypotheses that we think could explain why it was that they were spending time inside. So obviously the total mixed ration was inside. They know, they learn that's what's good to eat. That gives them their nutrition. So are they just being drawn straight to that? There was a 100-meter distance. So having gone inside, they would have to walk 100 meters to go out, and then it was another 100 meters coming in. So was walking distance a factor? But also the cows that we were looking at were actually on one of our partner agricultural colleges, and they were part of a genetics company's herd, and actually they've been reared with very little experience of pasture. So we did wonder if there was just something a bit unusual about these particular cows, that they just weren't used to pasture, which is why they weren't going out. But really, this first experiment showed us that, well, this is actually quite a complicated area, and it's something we've been working on, you know, for several years since. And I still think there's still research to be done until we really, you know, get to the bottom and fully exploit what it is that cows want. So the second experiment, so just let me go back one slide actually. So we have these 3 hypotheses. So these actually helped us come up with ideas for subsequent experiments. And so 3 of the following experiments are all really testing these hypotheses. Was it something to do with the TMR outside? Does the distance that they have to walk, is that a factor? And then also, is being reared without experience of the pasture, is that a factor? So again, we were able, we actually chose to test these as hypotheses. So the first of these was, well, what happens if we offer them this total mixed ration at pasture? Does that affect their preference? Because if it's that that's drawing them inside, then maybe we'll see that if you've got total mixed ration at pasture, that's something that you want. So this was the experimental setup for this particular study. I'm just going to move the Zoom window. There we go, let's get rid of it. So this is the particular study where, again, the cows would be taken to a choice point after milking. It was equidistant between the pasture and indoors. And then indoors, the cows had access to a total mixed ration. They had these individual feed intake bins so we can measure how much they were eating. And then when they went out to pasture, you can see there are 6 bins out in pasture. They're covered over just to stop the rain getting onto the feed. But these are individual bins. So 6 cows out of 12 in each of our replicates had access to TMR at pasture, and 6 of them didn't. So this was our experimental setup. What we found was actually there was no effect of having the TMR at pasture. So it had no impact at all on the amount of time that they're spending at pasture. But what we did see, and you can sort of see it here, but I think we've got it illustrated slightly better here, is that actually these cows in this second study had a strong preference to go to pasture. So they were going out to pasture, the graph over on the left there, they're going out to pasture for 71.4% of the time. They were indoors for 28.6% of the time. Compare that to the first study, and we've got pretty much the opposite story across these two experiments. So clearly, there was something we now think unusual, and we'll come on to what we think it was in a moment about study one. That actually what we found was these cattle in study two had this preference to be out to pasture, a strong preference of 71%. Now, a number of factors did influence that. The second study was quite a long study, and we started it a little bit late. We started it in late summer. So in study period one, which ran from the middle of August to the middle of September, we can see there was a really strong preference for pasture. About 90% of their time was out at pasture. But as we get into the autumn, so we go to study period two, and then when we get to study period three, when we're into October, November, we can see the amount of time they're spending at pasture is declining. What we know is happening is the weather conditions were deteriorating in the autumn. The ground conditions were getting wet. It was wet outside. We know from the previous studies the cows don't want to go out when it's wet. We know they don't like lying down in wet conditions. So actually we can quite clearly see here that their preference is changing towards the autumn, and when the conditions outside, when it's cold and it's wet, they don't want to go out. We also picked up this story around the night time. So what we can see is that during that study period one, strong preference to be out during the day, but actually as we went into study period two and study period three, that daytime use dropped quite early on, whereas what we see with the nighttime use is it stays high even through study period three and only starts to reduce in remains high in study period two and only starts to reduce in study period three. So what we're seeing is this, clearly they do seem to be more interested in going out at night. They're spending more time out at night. So again, this consistent story we're getting that there's something about being out at night that seems to be important to them compared with being out during the day. So we can sort of summarize this, that clearly we have this big difference between study one, where the cows prefer to be inside, study two with the opposite, and they want to be outside. Total mixed rations had no effect on their preference for pasture, so we can sort of rule that hypothesis out. What we did find, though, is pasture use declining as we progress from late summer into early winter through the autumn, with daytime use declining from the middle of September and then nighttime use from the middle of October. And again, we put this down to wet, cold weather conditions, being the main driver. So we have these contradictory results from study one and study two. What we do know is that the cows in study two, these were actually at the Harper Adams farm, our own university farm, are reared with access to pasture. So this really reinforced the idea that previous experience is going to be important. We couldn't test that immediately. It needed a bit of work to get that set up. But this was sort of our hypothesis that experience is something that we do need to look at. But we still had some other hypotheses to test. And one of the things we were interested in is looking at the effects of distance to pasture. Again, that was a difference between studies one and two. We had this greater distance in study one compared with study two. And as I mentioned in the introduction, where we do start to have differences in distance, we can then also start to look at motivation. Because really, distance, the amount an animal has to walk, that's a price the animal has to pay. So as we increase the distance the animals walk, that's a greater price. So the argument is that, they will only walk these longer distances if they're really motivated to do it. In other words, it lets us understand how hard are they prepared to work to get pasture access. So this shows the experimental layout. So what we had was our cubicle house. This is just a Google Maps aerial image So we had 2 replicates running at a time, A and B. Each replicate had their own paddock, and the cows were free to come and go between the cubicle house and the pasture. Some of the time it was at a short distance, 60 meters. Some of the time it was at medium distance of 140 meters. And then the long distance was 260 meters. And the results we get, again, are sort of look a little bit complicated, but we can look at some of the key points within these data. And actually what we found was, as we increase distance to pasture in this period between sort of 11 o'clock in the morning and then 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we do see a reduction in the time they're spending outside. So in other words, it looks like they are starting to reduce as we increase the price. They are starting to reduce their use of pasture. But crucially, it doesn't drop to 0. We are only seeing a bit of a small decline there, but we are seeing this decline. So we sort of argue that actually during the day, we've got moderate motivation to access pasture. Whereas in the evening period, as we increase distance, we've got pretty much the same use. In fact, I don't think there was actually any statistically significant differences between the short, medium and long distances. So we're arguing here we've got high motivation to go out. And again, the same story coming up. Going out at night seems to be important to them. Higher motivation, they're going out at night more. We've got this higher motivation for going out and using pasture at night. So what do we think is driving that? Well, as just sort of summarizes the results we've got there. Again, the strongest preference for pasture at night. And again, the cows were willing to walk further at night, but they're not willing to walk quite as far during the day. And we think what it's about is really they're going out at night. They're motivated to go out at night. And we think it's really related to lying comfort. Unfortunately, we weren't able to record what the animals were doing at night. We didn't have any, for example, ice cubes automatically measuring their behaviors. It would be interesting to repeat it again. But we do know that actually when at night time, cows are typically going out. They're not grazing at night. They don't normally graze at night. And we think what cows are doing when they're out is going out to lie down. So we think this now starts to bring in our thinking, well, actually, you know, is pasture preference something to do with having somewhere to lie down, somewhere comfortable to lie down? And we'll revisit this just a little bit a little bit later on. So we were also interested in just looking at whether or not the amount of grass we offer the cows, does that have any influence on their preference for pasture? Because in all of the studies we've done so far, the cows did have the opportunity to graze. So when they went out to pasture, there was grass available for grazing. But then the question is, well, how important is grazing to these animals? Does the availability of lots of fresh grass, does that change their preference? Is that giving us some insight into what's going on? Is it even changing their motivation? So for this particular study, we had an area, an indoor area with some continuously housed cows. And then there was a choice, cows that had a free choice, either from the indoor area, they could go out, and then depending on the exact treatment they were on at a particular time, there was 4 pasture plots. 2 of these were at a short distance, 2 of them were at a long distance, and they had different amounts of grass available in them. The larger plots having lots of grass, the smaller plots having very little grass. So this was our experimental setup. And again, different cows sort of rotated around this in different groups with sort of different replicates. And we had 2 levels of herbage availability. So we had a high level herbage availability, 3,000 kilograms of dry matter grass. So that's a nice leafy sward, lots and lots of grass for them to eat. We also, on the low treatment, it was down to 1,800, but although that looks to be only, you know, it's not even, it's more than half of the high treatment. Actually, a lot of that would be dead material. So when you're offering them 1,800 grams of dry matter per hectare, it's actually there isn't really very much grass there for them to eat. And as I mentioned earlier, we looked at two distances, so we could look at motivation. And we also had this continuously housed control group. And as it's turned out, actually, it was that group that gave us some of the more interesting results, because actually what we found was there was no effect of herbage allowance on how much time they spend at pasture. So in other words, grass availability doesn't seem to be that important in terms of driving them going out to pasture. Doesn't look like they're really going out to graze. They will graze when they're outside, but it doesn't seem to be that important to them, because you would expect if there was more grass making grazing more worthwhile, they would be out there more, but they're not. And the herbage allowances, had no effect, or there's no attraction really in terms of distance or the amount of TMR that they consumed. So grazing does not appear to be a major factor. But what we did find, though, was some very interesting results when we compare the animals shown in blue here. So these are the ones with pasture access, with those continuously housed cows. So those are shown in red. So one thing we found was the cows with pasture access had much longer lying times. So they're spending over 50% of their time lying down, as opposed to only about a third of their time lying down, or just over a third for the housed cows. When we look at the time spent eating the total mixed ration, they actually ate the same amount. The cows with pasture access ate the same amount of total mixed ration as those that were housed, but they ate it in half the time. They were doing a little bit of grazing when they were going out, not very much, but I think it sort of shows that it's almost as if the animals that had pasture access were eating this TMR quite quickly, so they could go out. They could maybe then top that up with a bit of grazing, but also when they went out, they could lie down. But we also were recording milk yields, and we were pleasantly surprised to find there was a big difference in milk yield. So the cows with pasture access were producing 25% more milk than the cows that were housed. So we were getting on average 33.5 kilograms per day from the pasture access cows, as opposed to about 27 kilograms a day for the continuously housed cows. That's a big difference. And we have some ideas as to why it was. So about half of that increase could be attributed to grass intake. So as well as eating their total mixed ration inside and outside, the cows that could go outside were eating just over 1 kilogram of dry matter grass a day. And if you look at the energy that was giving them, that would account for about half of the extra milk. But also those increased lying times, the fact the animals are resting more, I would argue they're probably a little bit less stressed. Animals that are lying down, we're going to see increased blood flow to the udder. So we think this might also be helping with their milk production. But it really shows that if we can get this right, if we can improve lying times, if we can reduce stress levels in the animals, maybe in terms of giving them pasture access, we can get very significant benefits in terms of production. So I think this is a really important take-home message that if we can get this right, there are these win-win-wins. We can get wins for production, we can get wins for the environment, because arguably this is a more efficient way of producing milk, but also it's good for animal health, it's good for animal welfare. So again, I think a very important result. So we've eventually got round to looking at our previous experience. We did a couple of these studies. I'm just going to present one of them. So again, going back to that very first study, those animals were reared without any experience of pasture, pretty much. Whereas the animals in study 2, Harper Adams, did have experience of pasture when they were being reared. So we were interested in looking at rearing our heifers with and without exposure to pasture. So group P, illustrated by the photograph at the top there, had maximum exposure to pasture, P for pasture, and then Z for 0. They had no exposure to pasture, as illustrated by the photograph at the bottom. And then we tested their preference, 24 animals in total, for pasture at about 16 months. So again, we're trying to understand, does the way that you're reared Does this influence your preference for pasture? And could it be that is actually resulting in those differences we saw in between study 1 and study 2? So I'm going to cut sort of pretty much to the chase with these in terms of going straight to the results. And what we found was, so as I mentioned in a moment, it was a bit of a wet year. So this is looking at the amount of time the animals spent indoors. We've got the cows reared without any exposure to pasture, group Z shown in red. And as you can see, they actually spent the vast majority of their time, nearly 80% of their time inside, almost sort of mirroring the results we got in study 1. The animals that had pasture access, they were spending about 55% of their time inside. But as I'll mention in a moment, it was actually quite a wet summer. And again, the animals don't like going out when it's wet, when there's wet conditions outside, and particularly don't like it when it's cold and it's wet. When we look at their behaviors, what we saw was there was very little, if any, grazing in the animals that had not had previous experience of pasture. So we would see about nearly 20% of their time spent grazing by those with pasture access where it was less than 5. And what they were doing is those that didn't have experience of pasture when they were reared, they were spending more time eating hay. They were also spending a lot of time investigating. And what we observed, and we do have some videos, I didn't try and share them because I think videos on Zoom can be a little frustrating, but they would often struggle to graze. They didn't really know how to graze. They were interested in investigating the grass, but clearly, if they're not reared with experience of pasture, then they were struggling when it came to grazing. So again, to summarize the results from the previous experience study, all of the heifers are spending at least half of their time inside. Again, it was a very wet summer in 2012, and we think the muddy conditions in the field were an important factor there in terms of putting them off going out and lying down. And compared to the animals that had pasture access, the ones that hadn't, they spent more time inside, they spent less time grazing, more time eating hay, and more time investigating. And this really sort of leads us to question, well, just, how innate is grazing? The innate foraging behavior for any mammal when they're born is to suckle, is to feed, and clearly there needs to be a learning component to grazing, a strong learned component to grazing. So it is their natural foraging behavior when they're adults, but it's something that they sort of need to learn. So again, I think that was quite an interesting finding. Right, so we're going to move on with really with the last 3 studies. We're moving a bit away from pasture, because when we sort of summarize the results so far, what's coming out quite strongly is this preference for pasture at night. What they seem to want to do at night is to go and lie down. So there did seem to be something around lying behavior that seemed to be important in terms of driving pasture access. So these are results from a student of mine, Laura Shoebridge-Carter, her PhD, where she had 3 experiments really trying to help us understand, well, what is it that cows value the most in a lying space? So her first study was what we call a trade-off study. So I'm going to explain it in a moment. But what we were interested in looking at is, well, how important is the amount of space that you have? So whether you're confined in a cubicle or whether you have somewhere open to lie down in terms of the amount of space, how important is that relative to this type of surface that you've got to lie on? And there are typically 3 types of lying surfaces used certainly within the UK and North America for dairy cows. They can have straw. You wouldn't normally combine straw with a cubicle. Straw would normally be in an open lying area, but we thought we would try straw. And typically cubicles either have a mattress, and this is what we tested in this, but also these cows had experience of lying on mattresses before. They had a mattress, or you would have sand. And these deep sand cubicles are, I think, probably a little bit more common in the United States. They are used in the United Kingdom, but they didn't, the cows in this study hadn't actually experienced sand before, and that sort of goes some way to sort of explain the results. And we did the study with 24 cows in total. So what we did, the experiment was done in 3 stages. So we first of all, we wanted them to get used to lying. These were on these, so the animals are in a pen. There are these 3 boxes with sand, straw, or a mattress. And then we could put cubicles on, or we could take cubicles off. So the first stage, the cows come in, they're on their own. They've got, we actually train them. So they have access to each of these in turn. So first of all, they can access, for example, we did this in a randomized order, but one individual might have access to the sand first, then the mattress, then the straw. And we just get them used to lying in these spaces. And then in this first stage, we would just measure their preference. Which of these do you prefer to lie on when there's a cubicle on it? Do you prefer to lie on the sand, the mattress, or the straw? And then we took the cubicles off and we did the same thing. We trained them to lie on each of them separately, so the others were fenced off. And then once we've trained them to lie in them with the cubicles off, we opened it up and they had free access to lie on any of them. And again, we recorded what they did. And what we then did, this is where the trade-off part comes in. So we would establish for each individual cow, what is her preferred surface? So if her preferred surface was straw, we would put a cubicle on the straw, but the other 2 surfaces, her second and her third choice surface, would be open. So in other words, she has a choice now. Does she lie on her preferred surface? But if she wants to do that, she has to do it in a cubicle. So she has to do it in a confined space. Or does she say, well, actually, space is more important to me than the surface, so I'm going to lie down on an open mattress, or if straw is your preferred option, I'd lie down on the open mattress. I won't lie down on the straw because there's cubicle, because actually what I value is having an open space to lie down. So just to illustrate that, this shows an animal that's choosing the surface. Might be a little bit hard to see, but we've got a cow lying there. Her preferred surface is the straw. The straw's got the cubicles on, but she's actually saying, well, actually, the straw is really important to me, so I'm going to lie on the straw, even though it has the cubicle, and I'm not going to choose the open space. In contrast, this cow here, again, she's in that far box. So again, her preference would be straw, but she's decided, well, actually, I want somewhere open to lie down. That's more important to me, so I'm lying down on the open mattress. So this is what we did. So what we found was slightly different results depending whether there was a cubicle on or not in stage 1 and stage 2. So what we found in stage 1, they didn't lie down on sand as much. And again, we think this was just a previous experience thing. These cows are experienced to straw and mattresses, which is why they didn't lie down on the sand very much. And when it came to having the open space, we got a strong preference to straw. So these animals do like lying down on straw. Interestingly, a little bit more time on the mattress when there was a cubicle, and maybe again, typically they would have open straw or cubicles and mattresses, but clearly their preference was for straw. Now, when we came to the trade-off, so what we're showing here in the grey, P1 plus cubicle, that's their preferred choice with the cubicle in grey at the bottom there. And then P2 is their second choice, but open. P3 is their third choice and open. And then the black is standing. And I think what we can see is they were laying down more on their second preferred surface, but when it was open. So actually what the cows are choosing is having a nice open lying space. That's more important than having somewhere that's open, is more important than having their preferred surface. And what we found was 14 out of 19 of the cows chose space for over 70% of their lying time. And certainly when there was unrestricted space across all of these studies, we found an increase in their lying time. So clearly having somewhere open to lie down is more important than the type of surface. So again, this gives us strong evidence that actually having somewhere open is really what they value, and space isn't that important. So the next study was a motivation study. So we're now giving the cows a choice, free access to free stalls, as shown over on the left there. So you can they can lie down on those free stalls as much as they want, and then for each group of cows, half of them could access a open mattress first, either half open straw first, and sort of vice versa. So we got rid of any order effects. But effectively, for the cows, they would part of the time they were tested with their the option to have the cubicles for free, or walking different distances to get access to an open mattress with some sawdust on it, as illustrated there, or an open straw. At the times, it was an open straw yard. So each group were tested, and again, we just effectively half the cows had the straw first, half the mattress. This just shows you, so actually we didn't have them walking down long outside raceways. We had a very long indoor raceway. It was a bit like a passport queue at an airport. So it would sort of wind along. This sort of gives you an idea of an aerial view. This is what it looks like to the cow, though. So it's a reasonably long passageway for them to walk down and around, going around some corners. And this just shows you a plan of the experimental setup. So you may or may not be able to see my pointer, but we've got these free stalls, the 6 free stalls that the cows could lie in. They had access to a milking robot, and then we had 3 different distances that they would have to walk to get access to either surface 1 or surface 2. And again, half of the time that was straw, half the time it was a mattress. The distances were shorter than we've used previously. So the short distance was 35, the medium distance was 81, the long distance 127, but it did include a number of turns. So the animals would have to do a 180-degree turn at the end of each run, so they could then continue, and there was 1 of those turns at 35, 3 of those turns at 81, and 5 turns at 127. So even though the distance is a bit shorter, there's some sort of additional cost with having to negotiate round the corner, and we think that was all part of the price that they paid. So on to the results. What did we find? Well, this is sort of showing what was happening in terms of how they were spending their time. Lying time, were they spending it on the open area that they've had to work for, or on the free cubicle shown in green? We are seeing a decline there in use. So what we were arguing was, well, this is again illustrates a medium motivation in terms of accessing these open lying areas compared to cubicles. So it is important for them to do it in terms of, they are motivated to do it, but it's not the strongest motivation that we've seen across these studies. But again, it's that price paid. How does this raceway compare with pasture? But crucially, we're in that meaningful phase, and they are motivated, and actually a stronger motivation to access the straw as opposed to the mattress. So when we look at the lying times for straw compared with mattress, we can see that we had significantly longer lying times on the straw on a couple of those occasions. So again, straw does seem to be a preferred surface, but actually having somewhere open to lie down, they do seem motivated to access that. There we go, but high motivation for straw. And then the final experiment we're coming to, so I think hopefully in terms of timing, we'll be doing fairly well in terms of me finishing the talk within the hour. So we're looking at the indoor versus outdoor mattress. So this is the same mattress that we've just used in the study we had a moment ago. We did take the sawdust off because we were interested to see, well, how important is going out to the cows? Do the cows value going outside, having somewhere to lie down outside, or actually is it just having somewhere open to lie down that's important, and actually being outside maybe isn't that important. So similar to the previous study, one of the options they had for free, they had free access to the inside mattress. And then we looked at a preference test where they had they're free to choose between the two, and then they had to walk increasing distances to get access to the outside mattress. And again, this just shows you the experimental setup. This was the preference stage, so the animals could come out from when they were from the milking unit or when they were introduced, and then they can walk to that middle area, and they can either go to the indoor mattress or the outdoor mattress. And then we had these two distances, a short distance of 75 with 3 turns, or a long distance at 120 meters with 5 turns. So these are provisional results. This work is still under peer review. But effectively what we found at the preference stage was there wasn't actually any significant difference. So there is a difference in terms of you're looking at the means, but actually the statistics showed that these weren't significantly different. So actually when it just comes to a simple choice of inside or outside with no price to pay, the animals, it's pretty much 50-50. What we found though was as soon as you have to pay a price, the amount of time they spend outside reduces dramatically. So we get a big drop as soon as they have to pay any sort of price. So again, it's sort of showing us that, having access to something that is outside, an open area outside, doesn't really seem to be that important to them. What seems to be important is just having these open lying areas in which they can lie down. So we've got low motivation to go outside, even at the short distance. Now I'll just skip back a couple here, actually, just to illustrate. Two arguments have been made that actually our building is quite nice and open. So there is actually lots of fresh air in there. It is actually quite an open building anyway. So that might influence these results. But certainly just in terms of having a roof over your head does not seem to be at all important to the cows. So in terms of wrapping up then, so why do we think cows value these open lying spaces? What is it? Why are open lying spaces important to cows? I think there are two things that are driving the fact that cows want these open lying spaces. So the first of them is comfort. So that cow isn't dead. It might look dead, but it's not. She's having a sleep. I see them in the field when I'm doing observations, and you think, oh, it has died this time, but he woke up, and she'll wake up and look around and then go back to sleep. This is how cows will sometimes lie. They don't sleep like this all of the time, but lying posture, it's more difficult. You can't lie down like that in a cubicle in one of these free stalls. So we think open space allows for these nice open spaces allow for these different lying postures. But I think the other challenge can be a subordinate cow can actually get trapped in a cubicle by an aggressive cow. And I've witnessed this on our dairy unit. And if you're a subordinate cow, and if a dominant cow gets you in a cubicle, it's very difficult for you to escape. You have to back into the other cow. She's going to be hitting you with her head. It's much easier to escape from open areas. And I think this is why we sometimes see, as illustrated in the photograph on the right, if the cow can manage to do it, and either they turn around in the cubicle or back in, we do get cows that actually use the cubicle the wrong way around. And I'm arguing, and it's often the little heifers that do this, I'm arguing that she's getting ready to escape. So I think this is also one of the challenges that we have really with cubicles, with free stalls. So what might the cow house of the future look like? Well, you can go and visit it. I think it's a very interesting project. CERN, it's maybe not, I'm not actually still on the call, maybe not too far from where you are in the Netherlands. So this is the Dutch cow garden. So what it is a nice open barn. The roof lets lots of light in. And what they have is this big open mattress. It's kept clean by a robot. It was actually designed around reducing ammonia because it keeps the urine and the feces separate. So the urine can drain through and be taken away. The feces sits on top. So the urease in the feces isn't coming into contact with the urea in the urine. But it does seem to be good for cow welfare. And I think this is a very interesting idea. And the idea is, so the robot wasn't working very well when we visited. So the mattress is quite dirty. But if they can get the robot working well, you know, can you have the same level of hygiene as a mattress and a cubicle? But can you have that with these nice open lying spaces? So I think, you know, I think this is what the future of cow housing might look like. Right, let's summarize. Coming up to, I've been talking for about an hour nearly. So time to finish and take some questions in a moment. So cows prefer and are very much motivated to access pasture compared to free stall housing, except when it's cold and it's wet outside. So in the winter, the cows themselves really want to be inside. It does appear to be driven largely by motivation to lie down in open spaces. We would like to do some more research looking at really preference between an indoor open mattress, something like the cow garden, and pasture. But at the moment, lying down in these open spaces seems to be one of the main drivers. If we can improve cow comfort, if we can improve lying times, we can improve milk yields, a very important take-home message from the production implications. And I still believe, even though we have shown that, you know, the cows aren't necessarily motivated to go out, I still think that the best option is really to give cows a free choice between pasture and housing, with the only exception being the winter. So is it time that we should think about moving on from free stalls? So I've sort of been putting this to a few people in the sort of UK industry. I'm not sure they're ready to go there yet, but, you know, given those production benefits, given the fact that we need to have systems that are good for cow welfare, I think something like that, the Dutch cow garden, the Dutch high welfare floor, really is something we should be looking at. So I'd like to thank you, and I think my understanding is now we're going to have a few minutes for questions. So I'll stop sharing.
So thank you very much, Mark. Those are wonderful experiments, 8 of them.
Yes, yes, it was a quick run through. I thought I wanted to give you a flavour of the sort of the breadth of the research, and also how it sort of builds, one study builds on another. But I hope you found that interesting.
Yeah. So thank you so much. I have some questions in the chat box.
Yeah.
Dr. Lori's asking that that's the last question.
Yeah.
So but I know some people will still post some questions that if you use another breed of cattle for the same study, is it possible to have the same results?
I think it would be very interesting. We have focused here on not only dairy cows, but also Holstein Friesian dairy cows. And I think we probably would see some differences, I think, because we've been selecting these cows. The Holstein genes are selected very much along total mixed rations. So I think that's an area where it would be interesting to look at other breeds, definitely.
Then Dr. Yaseri is asking, using my name, was there any individual differences in terms of motivation? Maybe some low or highly motivated cows.
Yeah, no, there are differences in motivation, and some animals do seem to be more motivated to go out compared with other animals. And I think this has been one of the challenges when it's come to analysing the results, because we're dealing with groups of cows, and you might have 2 cows that want to go out and 2 cows that want to stay in. You take the average, that's a 50% preference, but actually half of the cows want to go out and half of them want to stay in. So it is sort of different, and we do get some quite big differences. Again, we're not entirely sure what's leading to that. It would be interesting to explore that. Is there a genetic component? There is almost certainly a learnt component, as we've demonstrated. And so cows that have maybe not had as much pasture access when they've been reared, just depending on when the time of year that they were born. So if you were born in the autumn, you're going to be spending the winter inside. If you're born in the spring, you'll spend your first few months outside. You know, we haven't looked at this, but I think that could be something that is accounting for these differences. So no, it's a good question, and we do get big individual differences, and we should probably look at those.
Okay, thank you so much. Victor is asking if you took any health-related measures. Maybe you look at the feet of the cows, their leg, and if there was, you take any measure on stress?
Yeah, we chose cows that had good locomotion. So we didn't pick any cows that were at all lame, because we are looking at the distance walked in this final trial. They are walking on concrete. So we did just pick cows that were healthy. I think obviously had we picked lame cows, then, you know, they would have been less motivated. But all of the cows that we looked at were, you know, had either they had good locomotion, that they were all walking, they had healthy feet. We didn't really look at any other sort of health measures. You know, we tried when we sort of set the groups up to try and get them, you know, I think there was sort of similar stage in lactation. We generally avoid trying to use cows that are in estrus, because if you have one cow that's in estrus in a group of 5 cows, then, you know, they're so busy interacting with each other, they don't seem to be going out or anything. So we made a few changes just to try and make sure that we didn't have anything that interrupted with the experiment. But yeah, I think, you know, if you are giving cows, from a practical point, you know, if you are giving cows access to pasture where they can walk out, if that's a long distance, then you know it's only going to be a benefit to cows that have got healthy feet. So I think that's why it's important that, you know, farmers do look at making sure their cows have got good healthy feet if you are giving them pasture access.
Thank you so much. I think Victor is also asking, but I think you have answered this one when you were presenting. So did you look at yield from cows in the indoor and outdoor? I think you said we have 25% more milk from the ones that had access to pasture.
We did compared. That was just there was only one study we've looked at this, and it would be an interesting one to repeat. So we had this one study where where we just had this continuously housed group, and then we had the groups that had pasture access. Now it was had we known, you know, I think it was just we thought it would be interesting to give us a baseline. We weren't expecting these big production differences, and I think it's something we would need to revisit, because there is a sort of a caveat to that, is that the indoor group was larger. So I think there were about 20, might have been about 24 cows in the indoor group, and the outdoor groups were smaller. So there could be other factors there.
Yes.
But it just illustrated that big difference in line time. And I think, you know, even with large groups of cows, if they're out at pasture, you will get increased line times. Because again, they can lie down, they're happy to lie down. If a dominant or a bully, if an aggressive cow approaches them, they can wait until the last minute and then stand up and they can escape. They can't do that in a cubicle. And what happens in a cubicle is, if there's an aggressive cow, and I've witnessed this, all of the other cows are all coming out of the cubicles, because nobody wants to be the one that's caught in the cubicle. So everyone's sleeping is disrupted. There's a lot of chaos, a lot of stress, until the one aggressive cow is happy that she's done whatever it is she has to do in terms of beating up other cows. And then everyone goes back to resting. So I think we will get production differences, but you know, we probably need to do a proper study on that. But yeah, it's I think you know, we can get the win-win.
Thank you very much for that beautiful response. Then Victor is asking again, what are the practical challenges of providing outdoor access to cows in farm? Yeah,
they are big. They are big. It sort of comes down to sort of maybe a couple of things I've sort of half mentioned. One is just how close is it to the housing. So if you have a very long, you know, if you are putting cows out to graze, for example, then you might have a very long track that they have to walk down to get there. And then any lame cows are going to find that difficult. You might have what we call a loafing area. So this is just an area that is grass, not really designed for grazing. So, you're not too worried that there's much grass there. It's just somewhere for them to go out and lie down and interact with other cows. So that might be a little bit closer, but the weather has a big impact. So if it's been raining a lot and the ground conditions are wet and it's muddy, the tracks will get very muddy, the pasture gets muddy, the cows themselves don't really want to go out. But conversely, if it's very hot and sunny and there's no shade at pasture, then the cows might be getting heat stress. So they might be staying in just for the shade. So it is quite difficult to give them sort of pasture access. And this is why, what we'd like to see. So we're not saying that you don't give cows pasture access. What we'd like to do is make the indoor environment as close as we can to the outdoor environment in terms of what it provides, in terms of somewhere nice and open to lie down. But then also it's going to be dry, it's under shelter, it's in the shade. So, for much of the year, it's probably better than pasture. But we wouldn't want to see cows not having the opportunity to go out. We're not saying that cows should never go out. But can we get the situation where the cows themselves are happy for 90% of the time being inside, even if that's really just under a cover with the open sides?
Well, thank you very much. Just this quick question. For the first experiment, did you bother to check the temperature of the indoor and outdoor?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. We did look at temperature, and it was one of those that wasn't significant. So we looked at both indoor and outdoor temperature, but then crucially, we looked at how outdoor temperature, was there an effect of outside temperature on preference? And we didn't find any effect. We did find that in that second study, because it went into the autumn, that the animals were spending more time inside. And it was colder outside, but I don't think the cold is the problem. I think it's the wet. They don't like when it's raining, and they don't like lying down on wet ground, on soil, on mud. I think that's uncomfortable. They will be losing heat. So I think temperature maybe has a role to play, but I think it's one of the less important factors. And rain and maybe even wind also, it's those things that, driving rain, driving wind will that will make them colder than even if the air temperature was on a different day was a bit lower.
Thank you. I was particularly interested in the third experiment number 3. You said the cows, they prefer to graze in the night.
Yeah, well, this is really, so we didn't observe that. What we really sort of found across these studies is actually they don't graze very much at night. So so cows are diurnal animals. They're mainly active during the day, and then generally they're lying down and they're ruminating at night. They will graze at night. So in the spring and the autumn, when they're at pasture, when the night is quite long, because don't forget we're quite a long way north in the UK. So actually we have quite a big variation in terms of day length through the day. So in the summer we have long days and very short nights, and it's the other way around in the winter. So in the autumn, when they could be out grazing, but the night is quite long, they will sometimes graze. But typically, what we've witnessed in these previous studies is when they go out at night, they typically go out and they lie down and they're not eating, and that sort of makes sense with the results we got from study 3 in terms of them eating during the day. So when you're eating your total mixed ration, which you tend to do during the day, that's inside, and so actually you're going to be eating, you're staying where your food is almost during the day, And then because you're not eating much at night, you go out to where you want to lie down. And where you want to lie down is somewhere that's open.
Thank you so much, Mark, for this wonderful presentation.
Yeah.
And I hope participants all over the world who have joined have actually gained one or two things. And let me just see the next question in the chat box. Do you think it might affect methane production by each individual cow in housing with cubicles or open pasture?
One of the studies I didn't present, we did actually look at this, and we did get lower amounts of methane per kilogram of milk with the pasture access cows. So the cows that could go out to pasture and could graze were giving us, it wasn't a big difference, it was a significant difference, but yeah, we are getting low levels of methane. So that's quite good. It's in the right direction, in that we've got lower methane from again, the system that seems to be more comfortable to the cows. And I think that's an area that might be worth looking at. What we're not sure is how much of that is that a dietary thing, because if they're eating their total mixed ration as well as having some access to graze. A lot of the research I did before I joined Harper Adams was looking at diet selection. And I think there's some interesting, we know cattle do seem to be able to optimize their own efficiency of microbial protein synthesis in terms of selecting between grass and clover. We know they've got these diet selection goals. So I do wonder if giving them some diet, maybe that was a diet choice thing. And I think that's another area that would be interesting to explore. But yeah, I think there probably will be methane differences in terms of, and hopefully lower methane in the animals with pasture access. Yep, no, good question.
There is still something I don't understand. Maybe you can quickly shed light on it. Is about how animal agriculture contributes to greenhouse gas emission and things like that, and climate change. And can you please talk briefly about it? Thank you.
Yes, yeah, no, I can. I mean, I think this is an interesting and a quite contentious. There's a lot of discussion around this. It's not an area that I have huge expertise in. Fortunately, I do have some colleagues here who are very good at looking at exactly what the challenges are, and I think some of the issues are really related, I think, to when you start looking at the exact nutrients that you're getting, and a lot of it. So I think a lot of the comparisons in terms of methane production of livestock systems versus plant proteins, they're actually doing it on a calorie basis, when actually what you're getting from the animal is very high quality proteins. So when you do it on a nutrient like for like basis, actually you're getting a lot less methane per unit of nutrient. So I think that's one thing that I think is quite important, is actually having, making sure that you're using the right measures. It does also depend on, the global warming potential. So we know methane, has a very high global warming potential in terms of the amount of energy that's sort of trapped, as within the Earth's atmosphere in terms of high levels of methane, but it's a lot more short-lived than carbon dioxide. And again, I think there are some. When you actually start looking at the effects, quite often the methane is sort of over, it looks to have a much bigger effect than it actually does have. And then, of course, the other challenge with the statements is that animal livestock production takes up something like 75% of the land, but only produces something like 25% of the calories. But of that 75% of the land, the majority of it can probably only produce, it can really only produce grass. And at the moment, the only way, or the best way to convert grass into human edible protein is with a cow. So it's a very tricky area. I'm still a meat eater. I'm trying. Well, not trying. I have reduced the amount of meat that I eat. That's partly for sort of health reasons, partly for environmental reasons. But I do think, I think animal protein is been demonstrated. It's a good, good part of a balanced diet. And actually, if we want these grazed landscapes, if they're well managed in terms of the whole system sequestering carbon, then their footprint is not that big. So it's a difficult area, and there are people much better than me, qualified than me, to talk about it. But it's an important area, and as I sort of mentioned earlier, I think some of the work we've been doing shows that these grazing systems can actually produce lower levels of methane per unit of product. So it's I think moving towards these more sustainable systems, I think this behavioral component is really important. So as ethologists, we need to make sure that we're working to make sure we get these good production systems.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, we've got. I'm happy to work through them from the bottom just for now. And so we've got: do cows get frustrated if they don't have access to what they want? And how do they express that frustration? I think that's also a good question. And I think it's quite difficult because cattle and sheep, ruminants in general, they, unlike other species like sort of pigs and some of the non-ruminants, they don't seem to express their frustration quite as openly. So I think it's quite difficult to measure. What we do see is when they do get access to an open space is they seem very excited by it. They'll jump up and down on it, and I did have a video to share. They really do like these open mattresses and the open straw. So you almost maybe it's not actually a frustration behavior, it's a bit of a rebound behavior, sort of illustrating that they must have missed it. But I think they do, and it's one of those arguments. Well, if we're going to house cows continuously, are we better keeping them indoors all the time, rearing them indoors so they never get to know any better? But I think our research has shown that there are enough benefits to a bit of pasture access that we should be trying to incorporate it into cow management.
I think Pat is trying to ask, did the cow always have to make a long-term decision? Once decided for indoor or pasture, they have to stay there for, I think once they pick a particular one, they have to stay there for some hours.
No, what we've done in all of our studies is we've always given them a free choice. So we have had the first two studies, we took them to a choice point, and then they would choose one or the other, but they were then actually free. And if they, part of the way out, but then went inside, they could do that. We didn't stop them, but that would then be recorded unless they actually got into the field or unless they got into the building. So if you go part of the way out and then actually do end up coming into the building, that would be deemed as choosing inside. So now we've always given them this free choice. Oh, I say always. There was one study where we didn't do that, and I didn't present that one. And unfortunately, it was a wet winter, which impacted on lying times for the cows at pasture. So I didn't present that one. So we did have one where we allocated them, but because it was wet, they really wanted to come in. So this is why the free choice, I think, is, for me, it's the gold standard. If you can give them free choice, then the animals can choose what to do, and I think that will give you the best welfare outcomes.
Yes, you are right. That's the best.
Yeah.
Then Dr. Yasser is asking here if there was any difference in terms of disease infection for outdoor and indoor cows. Yes,
good question. I mean, we haven't really looked at this. I think again, one of the housing that we have is actually quite open housing. So it has open sides and a roof. We don't have any artificial ventilation because there's lots of natural air coming through. So actually our housing is very well ventilated. I think if your housing is not so well ventilated, then respiratory diseases would be a challenge. So I don't think we would be getting any health differences there. What we have found though is, again, standing on concrete, standing on slurry on top of concrete can lead to lameness. So having cows going out to pasture where the ground is softer can be better, but then you do also just need to be careful that there aren't, if you're having a raceway, you know, you don't want any stones that might injure their feet or things like this. So it's like all of these things, there are, you know, each one has got its own strength and its own weakness. But we didn't really pick up any differences. We weren't really looking for sort of health differences. But again, I think the fact we have these open buildings, I don't think we would pick up huge differences anyway.
Oh, thank you so much. And the last question, Dr. Yasser is asking if there was effect of previous experience on the choice of lying space, as in the place where they lie.
Yeah, no, that we did pick that up. So certainly, you know, we know previous experience, as I mentioned, affects pasture preference. And actually, you know, the animals that have experienced that have been kept inside, you know, do seem to prefer, certainly initially, lying down in cubicles. We also found in Laura's first experiment that the cows had just not experienced sand before. So they were used to a straw yard where you just have loose straw on the ground. They were used to having mattresses with some sawdust on. But when we gave them just this open area of sand, well, they wouldn't even walk on it initially. They just didn't know what it was. And what Laura had to do was train them that it was a safe thing to stand on, and she had to put some straw on to encourage them to lie down on it. So once they'd learned that they could lie down on sand, they would do that. But no, previous experience is a very important factor in preference tests. It's a good point, a good question, and that you do need to think about how this has influenced your results. And maybe ideally make sure that your animals have actually experienced all of the choices. You know, if you do actually want to look at their true preference, have they experienced all of the possible choices before you start your experiment, to make sure that, you know, you're getting rid of that as a potential confounding factor. So no, it's a good point.
Well, thank you so much. I think we have exhausted all the questions, and I need to confess to you that I like all the illustrations and the pictures.
Good. No, I like to try and add pictures and things and some diagrams to try and illustrate the point.
Yeah, so
I work in pictures, so that's good. I'm glad you appreciated it. Thank you.
And those are wonderful 8 experiments: indoor versus pasture, effect of TMR at pasture, effect of distance to pasture, effect of herbage availability, previous experience, what quality do cows value most in lying spaces, then free store versus indoor lying area, then indoor mattress versus outdoor mattress. Yeah. Those are wonderful experiments. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if somebody wants to say anything. If you want to say something, maybe you want to ask Mark some other questions, you can signify by the raise up of hand and I will unmute you. Okay. So Dr. Yasere, you can unmute yourself.
That's Cern again.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mark, for taking time out to present your research. When you first said you'll be talking about 8 experiments, I was like, wow, well, I really, really appreciate it. At least we now see, to me, what I actually learned as you were taking us through the experiment was ways by which we could design research questions, you know, the
Yeah.
one after the other step,
Yes.
taking one step at a time and
Yeah.
not trying to solve all the problem at once. So from one stage, the next question to ask, and that is something I've actually learned from your presentation.
Very good.
And I want to appreciate you again for not seeing us as a small group, but taking time out to contribute to our program. And I also want to use this medium to appreciate all the participants, and I hope you have learned something.
So Kalade, can you unmute yourself? Oh,
Okay.
so we can hear you now.
Okay. My question is based on the experiment. The outcome of the experiment, how does it benefit the farm community? That is, in terms of a cattle farmer, or cattle farmer or dairy farmer. How does your experiment benefit them? Is there any interaction?
Yeah. No, that's
between your experiment and them?
Yeah, that's that's also a very good question. So what I didn't do was to tell you how the research was funded, and probably about half of the research program has been funded by the Dairy Levy Board. So whenever milk is sold, a very small proportion of the sale price goes to the what's called the AHDB, and they have funded it. They're very interested. I think the research that I'm doing I think it is of practical relevance, but it's in a few years' time. So what we're doing now is really informing what cow housing will look like in 5-10 years' time. So it's more of a long-term thing, but I think that will benefit the industry in the medium term. But it's something that it's about making sure that our production environment is it's efficient in terms of the farmers' profits, but also it's sustainable, both economically but also environmentally. So again, we had the discussion around methane, and I think better understanding of cow behavior can contribute to that, but also systems that are good in terms of animal welfare. So I think it's getting designing those systems. So there will be a benefit. The work I presented today, it's going to be a few years' time. My other main area of research is precision livestock farming. So this is using sensor technologies to monitor animals, to detect when they're in estrus, to detect when they're sick, to monitor their health. That's got a more immediate. So one of the projects we did a few years ago, the company has now actually got it's improved the reliability of their estrus detection. So that's improving farm efficiency in terms of getting cows pregnant sooner, more reliably. But also we've got the lameness monitoring. So the system that we worked on can actually automatically monitor the animal's mobility, and it can pick up the very earliest stages of lameness. So it's having a positive impact, a very positive impact in terms of cow health, cow welfare, but also farm. So it's a good point. I think as researchers, you need to make sure that the work you're doing is going to have some industry relevance. But again, that will be over different timescales. So I hope that sort of answers that question.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I want to appreciate everyone for joining us today. You want to ask another question? You can unmute yourself.
Yes, one more question.
It's okay.
So I want to know what motivated the research. Is it out of curiosity by you research scientists, or is it an attempt to solve particular production problem among the farmers?
Yeah, no, that's also a very good question. I mean, it started. It was a bit of both, really. So it was sort of building on when I was in my previous job. I was looking a lot at diet preference, when I started my new job here at Harper Adams, when I moved to Harper Adams, they wanted me to look at more of a welfare component. My previous work there was a lot about diet selection and grazing behaviour. So there was a desire, because I was appointed as senior lecturer in behaviour and welfare. So there was this interest in terms of looking at animal welfare. But about the same time, there was a proposal to put in a very large dairy in the United Kingdom. So this was going to have thousands of cows. I probably should have said that the average dairy herd in the United Kingdom is, I forget the exact numbers, but it's maybe 200 or 300 cows. They're not the same scale as you get in the United States. So the farms are somewhat smaller. There was this proposal for a large dairy unit, and it would have been continuously housed. So there was a lot of interest in the press about it. And we thought, well, it would inform the debate if we could get a better understanding of what it is that cows what they actually want in terms of pasture access. How important is it to them? So that's sort of where it started. But then, like all research, you then follow the threads. So, the importance of lying spaces has become increasingly important as we've gone through, and that's now sort of the main focus. And it's shifted from being, what is it when, how important is pasture access to, well, what can we do to make buildings better for cows? Not saying that they should be continuously housed, but that if you are going to house them for part of the year, then, we should still be as good as we can get for them. And if we create a system where the cows themselves are actually happy, we open the gates and they look out and they don't go out, and they choose not to go out, then I think we've succeeded. We've come up with a cow house that is good enough to meet their needs all year round. That raises an interesting sort of public perception thing, because people, certainly in the United Kingdom, like to see cows in fields. So, and there is this argument, well, the research you're doing is it not more, is it not about seeing more cows being inside? And my argument is, well, if that's where they want to be, if that's what the cows want to be, if that's where they want to be, and we've given them every opportunity to go out, but they want to be inside, then isn't that good enough? So that it's an interesting sort of debate as to, what's the most important thing in animal welfare? Is it what the cows want to do, or is it what people think is right for the cows? And my argument is, well, it should really be more about what the cows want to do. But obviously, we sort of recognise that that people will have different views, and hopefully, we can sort of demonstrate through our experiments that, well, actually, this is what cows want, and this is why we think it's appropriate. So it is a challenge in terms of sort of managing, to some extent, managing the results and making sure that that they are interpreted correctly by other people.
So thank you so much, Mark. That was interesting. Those 8 experiments are superb. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. If you want to message us on LinkedIn or look at our profile or send messages to us, our LinkedIn name is Animal Welfare Group Nigeria, and that is also our Facebook name. You can also reach us on Twitter, that's at AWGM14, AWGN in a capital letter and 14 in number. And if you want to watch past presentations on this group, just go to YouTube, type Animal Welfare Group Nigeria, then you will see all those videos there. So I want to appreciate everyone for joining.